Every year, milk from cows on farms with no grid electricity ends up in the same refrigerated case as milk from a 1,000-cow operation with computer-controlled feeding systems. Eggs from farms that never install the power line get sold through the same wholesale channels as eggs from climate-controlled barns. And produce grown with horses instead of tractors gets loaded onto trucks belonging to regional grocery chains, next to produce grown with GPS-guided combines. People see that and assume there's a trick. No electricity, no modern machinery. And yet somehow, the food shows up at real commercial volume, on real shelves, at a real price. The honest answer is narrower and more interesting than a trick. Some of what people believe about this is true. A lot of it isn't. And the part that actually explains it isn't a secret at all. It's a set of very specific, very deliberate choices that took decades to build. Start with the biggest misconception. Because it shapes everything else, there is no single rulebook called the Amish way of farming. Amish communities are organized into thousands of local church districts, and each district sets its own ordnung, an understood, largely unwritten code that governs what technology is allowed. That code is set at the district level, not handed down from one central authority. So a farm in one settlement can permit something. A farm 2 counties over forbids entirely. Roughly 40 distinct Amish affiliations exist across North America, ranging from very conservative groups that restrict steel-wheeled equipment and phones on the property to New Order communities that allow rubber-tired tractors and, in some cases, grid electricity in the home. Any sentence that starts with "the Amish do this" is already on shaky ground. The honest version of this story has to keep naming which Amish, where, and under which rules. So set aside the Amish as a single group for a moment and look at one specific, well-documented rule that shows up across many old order districts: no tapping into the public electrical grid. That's real. But it's also narrower than most people assume. The rule isn't no engines or no power. It's specifically about the wire that connects a household or farm to outside utility infrastructure, what many Amish describe as a literal line to the world. Once you understand that distinction, the rest of the picture opens up because engine power itself is very much present on many of these farms. It just doesn't arrive through that wire. Walk into a farm shop in a district that follows this rule, and you'll often find a stationary diesel engine running, not attached to anything that looks like a car or truck, just bolted to the floor, driving a hydraulic pump or an air compressor. That pump and compressor feed lines running out to the barn and the workshop. And here's the part that surprises people the most. Standard factory-made machines, table saws, drill presses, balers, in some districts even milking equipment, get modified. Their electric motors are physically removed and replaced with hydraulic or pneumatic motors, so the same machine that would normally run on 110-volt current now runs on diesel-generated hydraulic pressure or compressed air instead. It's the same saw. It just breathes through a different lung. Amish shop mechanics have been doing this conversion work for generations, and it's a skill in its own right. Not a workaround improvised in desperation, but an established trade. Layer on top of that a second permission that shows up even in stricter districts. 12-volt battery power, the same kind of current you'd find in a car battery, is broadly allowed even where household grid current is not. That's enough for interior lighting, small hand tools, and increasingly LED lighting mounted on equipment and on buggies for visibility on the road. Add propane, commonly used for refrigeration, cooking, and water heating in many Amish homes and farm operations, and you start to see the actual chain. Diesel power drives hydraulics and air. Batteries handle light-duty electrical needs. Propane handles heat and cooling. None of it touches the public grid. All of it still runs machinery. No electricity turns out to mean something much more specific than most viewers expect, and once it's stated that specifically, the mystery mostly dissolves. The field itself is a different story, and this is where affiliation differences become impossible to ignore. In many old order districts, horses remain the standard power source for plowing, planting, and haying, not tractors. But even here, traditional doesn't mean unchanged. Amish-run machine shops have spent decades engineering horse-drawn implements with real modern features built in, including ground-driven hydraulic assist mechanisms that make horse-drawn equipment more efficient than it was a century ago. Some agricultural writers have credited Amish shops with contributing meaningfully to a broader resurgence of horse-drawn farm equipment innovation. That's a detail worth sitting with on the technology this video's premise assumes is frozen. Some of the real engineering is still moving forward. Now put a different farm next to that one, because this is where the variation stops being an abstract disclaimer and becomes something you can actually see. New Order Amish communities are documented as permitting rubber-tired, self-propelled tractors for fieldwork, and in many cases allow grid electricity and telephones in the home that Old Order groups restrict. Drive a few miles in a settlement with both affiliations present, and you can pass an Old Order farm running horses and a converted hydraulic saw, and then reach a New Order farm running a standard tractor with a standard electrical hookup. Same general community, same regional economy, genuinely different rules. That's not an edge case to footnote. That's the actual shape of Amish farming, a spectrum of negotiated boundaries, not one uniform system. None of this explains why the rule exists in the first place. And the why matters, because it changes what kind of story this is. The rejection of grid electricity traces specifically to the rural electrification push of the 1920s and 1930s, when power lines were reaching deep into rural America for the first time. Multiple Amish communities independently declined to connect, and the reasoning wasn't fear of the technology itself, it was what the wire represented. A permanent physical connection to an outside utility system, outside control, outside dependency. That connects to a broader, long-standing Amish principle of maintaining separation from the wider world. Resistance to self-propelled tractors followed a similar logic a little later. The concern documented in the historical record isn't really about engines pulling a plow. It's about a rubber-tired, road-capable vehicle undermining the horse-and-buggy standard that keeps the whole community moving at the same pace and by the same means, regardless of who's wealthier. These were never arbitrary rules about fearing machines in general. They were specific, reasoned boundaries about connection and mobility. Power and machinery only solve half the equation, though, because a farm still needs hands. And this is where family and community step in as a direct substitute for hired labor and mechanization. Amish families are large by design and by cultural value, and the kinship network that results is genuinely enormous. One estimate from peer-reviewed research on Amish enterprise puts a typical Amish adult in their mid-30s at the center of roughly 250 living relatives. That's not just a big family gathering, that's a standing labor pool, work bees, and barn raisings that can be called on when a job needs more hands than one household has. Where a conventional mechanized farm would buy a bigger machine or hire seasonal labor, an Amish farm in many of these communities calls on a network instead. It's a different kind of capital, but it's still capital, measurable, reliable, and built over generations. That same strength carries a real cost, though, and it's worth naming honestly rather than skipping past. Large families historically meant abundant farm labor. They also meant, eventually, more children than any farm could subdivide land for. As land prices climbed through the last quarter of the 20th century, and as mechanized non-Amish farms became harder to compete against without matching their equipment, a structural shift took hold. By 2009, according to peer-reviewed research based on interviews across 23 settlements, more than half of Amish households already drew their primary income from something other than farming. Small businesses, trades, contract work. That figure is now well over a decade old, and the pattern has likely deepened since. Farming remains the culturally central, most visually recognizable Amish occupation. It is no longer, in many settlements, the majority Amish livelihood. That's a real trade-off, not a footnote. Restricted mechanization has a documented economic cost, and it helped push a lot of households out of the field entirely. For the farms that do stay in production, though, the real answer to how do you reach commercial scale isn't in the barn at all. It's in the marketplace, and it starts with dairy. Amish and Mennonite dairy operations commonly run herds in the range of 35 to 40 cows. That's an approximate figure, not a precise census number, but it's consistent across the sources that track it. Compare that to a U.S. sable. Average dairy herd that grew from roughly 112 cows in 2000 to roughly 283 cows by 2021, and to large confinement operations running anywhere from 400 to several thousand cows. By that measure, a typical Amish dairy farm isn't competing on size at all. It's smaller by a wide margin. And yet that milk still reaches the same commercial pipeline as any other dairies, because these farms sell into mainstream cooperatives. Documented relationships exist, for example, with regional dairy cooperative associations that also handle conventional dairy supply. The milk doesn't know which farm it came from once it's in the tank truck. Produce works the same way, just through a different institution, the auction. In Holmes County, Ohio, the Mantine Hope Farmers Produce Auction, founded in 1995, functions as a genuine wholesale market, one of the largest of its kind in the state, drawing the large majority of its product from local growers in Holmes and Wayne County and selling in volume to grocery chains and wholesale buyers. A small Amish-run vegetable operation doesn't need to be big enough to supply a supermarket chain on its own. It needs to be one of many growers feeding one auction floor, and the auction does the aggregating. That's the actual mechanism behind at scale in this story. It was never one enormous farm. It's dozens or hundreds of modestly sized farms, engineered by their own communities to plug into a shared marketplace built for exactly this purpose. Poultry and eggs follow a related but distinct model worth handling carefully because it's the one place where this story gets genuinely complicated rather than tidy. Contract poultry and egg integration, where a grower owns the physical operation but sells output to a cooperative or company on a standing contract, is already standard practice across the broader U.S. poultry industry, and Amish and Mennonite growers participate in versions of that same structure. One documented example, a Missouri and Arkansas-based cooperative, is reported to include over 160 Amish and Mennonite-run farms, some averaging tens of thousands of birds each on multi-year purchase contracts. That is a real industrial-scale number at the level of an individual operation. And it should not be smoothed over into the same no modern machinery story as a 35-cow dairy or a horse-drawn vegetable plot, because an operation running tens of thousands of birds typically depends on significant engine-driven infrastructure for ventilation and feeding. This is one documented case, not proof of a typical Amish farm. But it's an honest reminder that Amish farming isn't one economic model with one ceiling. It's several, and they don't all look the same. Which brings up the part of this story that runs directly against what most viewers expect. Growth, in many of these communities, isn't unlimited. It's capped, on purpose, by the same church structure that sets the technology rules. Peer-reviewed research based on interviews with Amish business owners documents informal employee limits that vary by affiliation, roughly 5 or 6 employees in more conservative communities, up to around 30 in more change, accepting ones. And it documents actual, on-record cases of church leaders stepping in to force a business owner to shrink an operation or sell it outright once it grew past what the community considered appropriate. Excommunication sits behind that enforcement as a real possibility. Picture a farm-adjacent business doing well, expanding, hiring, and a bishop or a church committee deciding it's gotten too large and the owner scaling it back down. That's not a hidden route to unlimited growth. It's the opposite. A built-in ceiling that keeps any single operation from becoming the kind of sprawling, machinery-heavy enterprise the original premise of this video pictures in the first place. That ceiling comes with an upside that's easy to miss. The same research that documents size caps also documents something else. Amish business failure in the first 5 years is reported at under 10%, against roughly 50% for U.S. small businesses generally. That figure comes from one settlement's data combined with interviews with accountants and lawyers who work with Amish clients. It's not a national statistic, and it shouldn't be treated as one, but it points to something real. Low-cost internal capital, community credit arrangements, family labor instead of payroll, and a deliberate refusal to overextend all reduce the kind of risk that sinks a lot of small businesses. The same forces that cap how big something can get also seem to make it more likely to survive at whatever size it settles at. It's worth being honest, too, about what smaller scale actually costs in output, because this isn't a story where the restricted approach quietly wins on every measure. A peer-reviewed study of Pennsylvania dairy farms, built on USDA survey data, treats Amish operations as their own distinct management category, defined specifically by draft animal power and the absence of grid electricity and mobile-powered equipment, and finds that confinement farms, the highly mechanized kind, produce significantly more milk per cow and run larger herds than the survey average. In plain terms, cow for cow, a modern confinement dairy is likely to outproduce a comparable Amish operation. That's a real trade-off, not a talking point either side gets to skip. Restricted mechanization doesn't erase the productivity gap with industrial agriculture. It just means the farms that operate this way have built their economics around labor, land, and community infrastructure instead of around raw per-animal output. And for a lot of these farms, that's proven to be enough to stay commercially viable, even if it's not enough to outproduce a confinement operation cow for cow. There's one more honest thing worth saying, plainly, without turning it into a punchline. Farming and road travel by horse and buggy carry measurable injury risk, the same way any farm work or road use does. A peer-reviewed study covering Pennsylvania between 2010 and 2013 recorded an average crash rate of roughly 89 per 100,000 people in the Amish population per year for horse and buggy incidents, and a higher rate for general farm equipment. Children take on real farm and animal care responsibilities from a young age in many of these households, which is a long-standing pattern across rural life generally, not something unique to Amish communities, and it carries its own documented risk profile. None of that is a reason for shock or judgment. It's a genuine trade-off that comes with this way of working the land, the same as it does with any farm work anywhere, and it deserves to be stated as fact rather than spectacle. So return to the original puzzle: farms with no grid connection and no standard tractor, somehow reaching real commercial shelves. The honest answer was never a single dramatic exception, and it was never a secret. It's a chain. Diesel engines driving hydraulic and pneumatic systems where grid current would normally go. 12-volt batteries and propane covering what's left. Horse-drawn implements quietly re-engineered for efficiency by the same communities using them. Large families and communal work events supplying the labor that machinery supplies elsewhere. And underneath all of it, cooperatives and auctions built specifically to take many small, individually modest farms, a 35-cow dairy here, a horse-drawn vegetable plot there, and aggregate them into something that genuinely reaches supermarket shelves and grocery chain trucks. The scale was never inside any one farm. It was built, deliberately, in the space between farms. And running alongside every part of that system is a ceiling these communities put there on purpose. Church leaders willing to make a thriving business shrink rather than let it outgrow the community that built it. That's the real shape of this story, not a rejection of the modern world, and not a mystery. A set of very specific boundaries, engineered around on every other front, held in place by people who decided exactly how far they wanted commercial success to go, and then made sure it never went further than that.